We meet, as it happens, at a very important, constitutional moment. We are meeting on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the adoption by Israel of its basic laws on human rights, what was known at the time and has become known since as the Mapach Chukati, the Israel's constitutional revolution. And while I am delighted, as we all are, that Menachem Ben Sasson is the president of the Hebrew University, I regret only that he is not there to continue the work that he was engaged in with respect to this Mapach Chukati. And this constitutional revolution, what is not perhaps so well known, is that it was anchored in the Canadian constitutional revolution of 10 years earlier, of 1982. Indeed, some of the language in the Israeli Basic Law was adopted very much from the Canadian Basic Law. The basic difference, however, and it's particularly important and relevant for this panel, is whereas under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it speaks of rights and limitations on those rights as having to comport with the values of a free and democratic society. In Israel, the notion of the rights and limitations on those rights are those that have to comport with the notion of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, as that which is consonant with Jewish values and democratic values. And as it happens, as a Canadian MP and during the period of Minister of Justice, I actually took the framework that had been developed here in Israel in terms of that symbiosis of Jewish and democratic values, and indeed in particular Jewish values, to actually anchor my work as an MP and as a Minister of Justice. I'm going to very quickly give 4 examples of that, which will lead me into that which I hope to have some time to discuss, and that is to look at the present relationship to immigrants and asylum seekers with regard to Africans in Israel, and how that relates to the notion of Jewish and democratic values. I just want to say, as a basic thesis that will frame everything that I will be saying today, that I do not regard the notion of Jewish and democratic as being inherently in conflict. I agree with that which Natan said about the notion of particularism and universalism with regard to identity, and when Micha spoke now, that the challenge really is to enhance both the Jewish and democratic and not see it as being in conflict. And those that say that if a state is Jewish, it can't be democratic, or that if it's democratic, it can't be Jewish, that is not so much an argument as it is an uninformed conclusion. And I think if those who want to make that point, then they should engage in argument. They shouldn't put it forth as a conclusion which precludes any basis for argument. Now let me take the four basic Jewish values that I relied upon with respect to my work in Canada. The first value was the importance of zachor, importance of remembrance. And of course this becomes inextricably bound up with the notion of Holocaust remembrance. Remembrance of horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. The discourse around Zachor in Canada led to the adoption of a National Holocaust Remembrance Act, such that we have a Yom HaShoah Remembrance Day in Canada, not in accordance with any secular calendars, January 27th, the European community has, but with regard to the Yom HaShoah at the same day that it is commemorated in Israel and with the Jewish people. So here's the first notion of Zachor. But there's another notion of Zachor, and that is that Zachor is not only inextricably bound up with Holocaust remembrance, it's inextricably bound up with the principle of equality. Zachor ki ger hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim. So you have to remember that you too were a stranger in Egypt, that there must be one law for you and the stranger. You know all the psukim and the makorot, I don't need to go into it. But this foundational notion of equality, as drawn from Jewish values, influenced my own approach to equality. And so, as the one example, in 2005, I declared 2005, which was at that time the 20th anniversary of the coming into effect of the equality rights provision under Charter, as being the year of equality, and proclaimed it with the notion there in Canada, not here, Ukratem dror b'chol haaretz, and you shall proclaim freedom and equality throughout the land. Because for me, the notion of Jewish values had a universality about it that in fact could resonate for a society like in Canada. The third Jewish value was the notion that the test of a just society is how does it treat the most vulnerable amongst it? How does it treat its sick and elderly, its racial and religious minorities? How does it treat its immigrant and refugees and the like? And again, the makarot, the sources are clear, lo tonu et hager, and so on. And so the principles here of what the test of a just society is all about. And the fourth value, and the one that leads me into the discussion with regard to what is happening now here, is the dangers of hate speech, the dangers of assaultive speech. And here I have to invoke not only the sources, but really my mother, Zichrona Livracha, who taught me before I understood the profundity of this, that achayim v'amavet biyad halashon, that life and the death is on the tip of the tongue. The al terech rachil ba'mecha, don't go up and down your community being engaged in any form of assaultive or hate speech and slander and the like. And it is these four values that I want to speak to now, in particular with the last value with regard to what is happening now in the legislation now being addressed with regard to migrants and asylum seekers in Israel. The first is, I'm concerned with the terminology that is being used in the discussion. The notion of mistananim, the notion of infiltrators. And yes, there are infiltrators, but to use that as a term to apply to all the people who are migrants or asylum seekers presupposes a judgment that in effect predetermines the outcome. One has to have a process to determine if somebody is or is not a refugee. One cannot, by labeling them as an infiltrator to begin with, predetermine the outcome. The second thing is the danger of the hate speech in the context of the siach tziburi, in the public discourse. I don't have to review or go over some of the things that have been said in the course of the debate here in Israel. But I have to say that in fact they breach that principle of achayim v'amavet biyad halashon. And I'll say no more on that, not only for reasons of time, because frankly it's an abuse to sensibilities to go ahead and invoke some of the things that were said in that regard. The third thing, with respect to the question on refugee law and relationship. Now, Israel, to its credit, was the first country internationally that ratified the Refugee Convention. Not surprisingly for a country that really effectively was, in its birth, a nation of refugees. Not only was the first to ratify, but effectively framed and helped draft the Refugee Convention. And Israel, being true to that, also recognized that most of those who are here now from the African community, and here I want to say that the part of the mistaken nature of the discourse is that the word African is an overgeneralized term. Because here too one has to speak in terms of differentiated identities. Some 80% of the Africans who are here are those who are from Eritrea and Sudan. And I say this because Israel rightly and properly conferred a particular protected status on the Eritreans and the Sudanese. That protected status, however, means that, and the reason it was because of non-refoulement, that under the Refugee Convention, you cannot return somebody to a country where they have a well-founded fear of persecution. So let me just close by saying that I hope in the Siach I'll be able to say something about this matter a little bit further, but I want to end with a quote from one of the judgments, the quote that I felt was so singularly important with regard to our public discourse on this issue. And it's in the quote from Justice Barzan, where he says as follows. I'm doing it in English, it's actually better in Hebrew, where he says, "Hatred of strangers is a double curse. It slaughters the image of God of the one who hates, and it thrusts evil on the one who is hated through no fault of their own. We must act in a humane and patient manner towards all those who are created in the image of God, and to uphold the broadest principle of equality of rights and obligations among all people. Now, I understand that in dealings with these issues of refugees, one has to keep in mind that Israel is not like any other state. It is, in fact, a Jewish and democratic state. And one has to also always appreciate context. It is not a state like any other democratic state that may be living in peace and security like a country like Canada. It is a country that is living in a state of war and hostile environment and the like. But having said that, I think the notion, however, of respect for the sanctity of human life, of the respect for human dignity, kvod ha'adam v'cheruto, of respect for the fundamental values that are involved in saying the notion of achayim v'amavet biyad ha'lashon, that has to frame our discourse and our policy in these matters. Thank you.